He couldn't say exactly when this turning point occurred in his life, but Robert always knew that he was interested in things that might scare others away. Perhaps it started as a child, when he watched with bated breath reports about creepy finds in abandoned houses, murders that no one could even think about, or about strange, unexplained disappearances of people. His imagination was always occupied with questions about what was really going on in such places, what horrors remained behind the scenes of news headlines. Robert grew up, but his craving for creepy and scary stories remained. He became a journalist specializing in investigations of mysterious accidents and deaths. The reputation of his publications brought him attention. But with this reputation came a new reality. A reality where his phone did not stop ringing, and people called him as the last resort, asking for help to sort out the strangest and most mysterious cases. His new life was like a long-running horror movie, where each new plot was scarier than the previous one. He happened to visit places that were told about by the most terrible urban legends. He had seen photographs in which barely noticeable shadows and figures seemed to be participants in some ancient drama. He interviewed people whose lives had been ruined by unexplained incidents. And although Robert knew that every such case lends itself to some kind of explanation, the further he progressed along this path, the more he doubted the reality of his own reasoning. The last call was one of those that throw you into a cold sweat. On the other end of the line, the voice of a man could be heard breathing nervously and hurrying to pronounce the words before he lost control of himself. His name was Mark, and he worked as a security guard in an abandoned factory, a place that once produced products for millions of people, but now this building stood empty and destroyed. Mark claimed that something was happening on the premises, something strange. People saw silhouettes moving around the perimeter, and some of the workers hired to clear the area simply did not return to their posts. The police checked the factory several times, but did not find anything suspicious. However, each new guard sooner or later left the post, leaving behind only vague explanations and fear in the air. "There's something there," Mark whispered into the phone. "These are not people. I do not know what it is, but it looks at us as if it is waiting for something." For Robert, it was an opportunity to uncover more than just another mystery. He felt that this case was different from anything he had encountered before. This place itself was dead, cold, and imbued with a sense of unrelenting terror that permeated the air. He agreed to go. A few days passed, and Robert found himself in front of the huge gates of the old factory, which had long been covered with rust and graffiti. The dilapidated walls of the building towered like grim witnesses to something forgotten. The guard Mark was waiting for him at the entrance. His eyes betrayed sleepless nights and anxious thoughts. "Thanks for coming," he said, closing the gate with trembling fingers. "This place, it's like it's pulling something out of people." "Tell me everything from the beginning," Robert asked calmly, taking out a dictaphone. "We have been working here at night for almost a month now." "Everything was fine at first," Mark began, heading towards the administration building. "But after a week, we started hearing strange noises. It's like someone is scratching the walls, walking through the corridors. At first they thought it was rats or the wind, but then things only got worse. People began to see something, shadows, silhouettes. Someone claimed to have seen a man with a rusty crowbar, but when they checked, no one was there. And recently, 2 workers disappeared." Robert listened attentively, trying not to show his anxiety. There have been enough cases in his career where fear and paranoia have supplanted reason, forcing people to see things that aren't really there. However, an inner voice told him that there was more to this story. He felt it in the tense atmosphere, in the abandoned corridors, in every trembling word of Mark. They reached the main workshop, where work had once been in full swing. Now it was an empty and echoing space where the cold was coming from. The walls were covered with mold, and the air was saturated with dust and a musty smell of dampness. The boarded-up windows let in barely any light. Time seemed to have stopped here forever. Mark stopped at a table with maps and drawings. "We were trying to figure out what could have happened." He ran his finger over one of the sheets. "And then we came across these old schemes. Judging by them, there are several more basement levels under the building, which no one knew anything about. And we think something might be connected to them. Are you saying that someone lives there, underground? Robert asked, feeling an unpleasant tingling in his stomach. I do not know what is there, Mark replied quietly, but everyone who goes down there doesn't come back. The main plot. Robert thought about what he had heard for a long time, replaying every detail in his head. An abandoned factory, the disappearance of workers, strange sounds, and incomprehensible patterns. It was one of those moments when he had to give up and just leave without looking back. But his professional curiosity, coupled with a deep fear of the unknown, forced him to move on. He decided not to waste time and go to these mysterious cellars that Mark had mentioned. The factory building turned out to be much larger than it seemed at first glance. They walked through long corridors, descending lower and lower, until they found themselves in front of an iron door covered with rust. There she is, Mark said softly, looking at the door. It leads down to the cellars. The door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Robert pulled on the handle, and the door gave way with difficulty, making a long screech. Beyond the door was a dark flight of stairs leading down. The steps were steep and covered in mud, and the air was even colder than above. They went downstairs, lighting the way with lanterns. The lower they descended, the more the walls seemed to shrink around them, and the silence became more oppressive. At the bottom of the stairs there was another door that led to an underground corridor. The air was even heavier here, almost unbearably damp and musty. The corridor was narrow, the walls were made of old brick, which was cracked in places. The floor was covered with water, and every step they took echoed. We're almost there, Mark whispered, looking ahead. There was another door at the end of the corridor, similar to all the previous ones. Robert and Mark stopped in front of the door. Mark, trying not to show fear, reached out, slowly turned the rusty handle and opened it. A pungent smell of rot mixed with dampness immediately hit my nose. The room they entered was gloomy, like a basement that had been forgotten for many years. The light of the lanterns illuminated the shabby walls and the floor, strewn with debris, the remnants of something long forgotten. It's here, Mark muttered softly, his voice trembling. They walked along the dark corridor, cautiously looking around. The air was heavy, and it was getting harder to breathe with every step. The lanterns picked out metal objects, tools, pipes, and old cars from the darkness, as if all this was left over from some recent nightmare. Robert walked slowly, his mind trying to catch every sound, every rustle. And suddenly they heard it, a thud, somewhere deep under their feet, as if someone was hitting the wall or floor trying to get out. Mark stopped, his face turned pale, and his breathing became heavy. It's them, Mark gasped, clearly horrified. I've heard that before, when those guys disappeared. Who are they? Robert frowned, realizing that now it was far from something strange. Is it someone alive? Mark nodded, his eyes trembling with fear. Robert couldn't afford to panic. He went to the place where the knocking came from and began to carefully examine the floor. It was a metal grate covered with dirt and mold. He crouched down and shone his flashlight on her. There's someone there, he said softly, lighting up the hole in the floor. There was a narrow tunnel under the grate, leading off into the darkness. At that moment, a faint moan came from the tunnel, quiet, almost inhuman, like the sound made by a person who has been in terrible conditions for a long time. Mark stepped back, his legs shaking and his hands shaking nervously. Robert listened again. It wasn't just sounds, it was the screams of people. We have to get them out, Robert said with unwavering determination. Are you crazy? Mark looked around quickly, as if expecting someone to come out of the shadows. No one came back from there. There's death there. I'm telling you. You said yourself that people are disappearing, but if they're still alive, we can't leave them. He began frantically searching for a way to remove the grate. It was tightly bolted with rusty bolts. Robert reached into his pocket for a knife, trying to loosen the fastenings, but the bolts were too old and stuck tightly. Suddenly the screams under the bars became louder, more unbearable, and there was real agony in them. Mark whispered nervously, almost in a low voice. They'll be back. We have to leave. They always come back. Robert shot him a sharp look. He knew that despite his paranoia, Mark wasn't joking. Something was really going on in this place, and it was worse than any rumors. He felt that human lives were at stake, and he couldn't afford to ignore it. They continued to move along the tunnel. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and now every breath burned my lungs with cold. A massive steel door, covered with rust and dust, appeared ahead. Robert looked at it carefully, noticing scratches on the surface, as if someone was trying to get out. "Whatever happened here?" Robert began, looking at the door. "It wasn't an accident. Someone is hiding here, and I'm not sure they want to be found." Mark nodded silently. There was panic in his eyes, but he was ready to move on despite the fear. Robert grabbed the old door handle and pulled it. The door gave way with difficulty, making a sharp screech. A long corridor opened up in front of them, with dim light barely illuminating the walls. When they entered, it was immediately clear that it wasn't just a vault or a basement. It was something much more terrifying. The floor was covered with old mattresses, covered with dirt and stains of unknown origin. Some of them had old, worn-out clothes on them, as if there had once been people here. There were chains on the walls that seemed to be part of some ancient mechanism that had been used here for a long time, for unknown purposes. There was a man lying on one of the mattresses. He was so exhausted that he looked more like a shadow. His eyes were full of horror. His mouth was slightly open, but he did not make any sounds. His face was haggard, covered with dirt and bloodstains, and his arms and legs were bound with steel handcuffs. There were bruises on his neck, as if he had recently been tortured. "Oh my God," Mark whispered, coming closer. Robert immediately rushed to him, checking his pulse. He was barely noticeable. The man did not move, but his eyes seemed to be trying to say something, to warn. Robert looked around for something that could help free him, but found nothing suitable. "We need to go get help." Mark looked around nervously, his panic growing by the second. "We can't leave him here," Robert replied sharply. They both knew that something was going on in these dungeons. Robert felt his heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. He continued to examine the man, trying to find a way to remove the handcuffs. Suddenly, their attention was attracted by the sound of footsteps, muffled, barely distinguishable, but approaching from the depths of the tunnel. Mark froze, his face paled even more. Robert grabbed his arm. "We need to leave. Right now." They rushed back to the stairs leading outside. The footsteps grew louder, getting closer, as if someone was following them. Every second they heard more and more distinct sounds, as if something or someone was literally stepping on their heels. Robert and Mark, barely able to control their panic, rushed down the corridor, their footsteps echoing through the narrow tunnels. Fear and adrenaline sometimes prevented them from moving, but they knew they couldn't go back. Suddenly, there was a loud crack from around the corner, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. Mark screamed, his fear running wild. "Faster, faster," Robert shouted, barely hearing his own voice. They rushed to the stairs leading to the upper levels of the building. Wet patches slid under their feet, and their every step seemed to be half increasing, half slowing down. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder, as if someone or something was inevitably chasing them. Robert shouted to Mark, "Stay behind. I'll check if someone is blocking our way." He turned his head back and saw shadows moving along the corridor. They were blurry, almost inhuman, but clearly dangerous. Ahead, the staircase seemed endless, its metal steps creaking under their weight. When Robert and Mark finally reached the ground floor, they quickly realized that this building was even scarier than they could have imagined. Every corner, every room hid shadows and fears that they could not fully comprehend. The memories of the room with the exhausted man and the sounds that the grill made were haunting. "Where is the exit?" Mark exhaled, looking around for some way out. "We have to find a way out of here," Robert replied, trying to remain calm. He was already ready for any turn of events, but an inner fear is gnawing at him from the inside. They found a doorway that looked like a random exit, but it turned out to be littered with old things and trash. Robert began to clear the way, although it was tedious and took a long time. At that moment, there was a sharp thud. They froze in place, listening. The sound was repeated, this time from the other side, from the direction they had just come from. It looked like someone was approaching them, and the thought was extremely unpleasant. Mark, panicked again, whispered, "I can't take it anymore. I can't stand it." Robert, seeing Mark's growing desperation, decided to act. He grabbed him by the shoulders and, trying to prevent a complete panic breakdown, pulled him along. They needed to move on. Finally, after an agonizing search, they found a way out of the building. It was blocked, but Robert managed to break through it using all his strength. When they got outside, they were greeted by the sounds of the city, which seemed almost soothing after the creepy experience in the basement. They looked around and saw that everything looked calm and normal on the street. At first glance, there were no signs of danger, but both knew that this building was hiding something terrible. Robert and Mark had difficulty moving, and they felt relieved only when they were far from that place. They called the police and told them everything that had happened, but the details of their story sounded so improbable that only some of them were taken seriously. All they managed to save were their own lives. No one could explain exactly what they saw and what kind of horror was hiding in that building. However, they knew one thing: the evil they had experienced was real, and it left a mark on their souls forever. Mark couldn't stand the stress, and eventually he couldn't return to normal life. Robert, despite his courage and determination, often experienced nightmares and searched for an answer to a question that remained unanswered. How many more people could have been left in this terrible place, and what exactly was happening outside its walls?